two guests, Dr. John Alexander and retired Colonel Phillip Corso. Gentlemen, you're back on the air again. John, where would you think it would be appropriate we take the story now?
Wow. Well, we have kind of gone all over. I think what Phil did from his perspective for research and development. Let me, maybe I'll add another note, if I might. I have had the opportunity to talk to a number of Phil's contemporaries, and the story is very interesting, and I've got to tell you, it's a paradox. I'm talking about people who went on to have ranks at 3- and 4-star general levels, who were colonels at the time.
Right.
And I would ask them, the big question is, where'd this stuff go? And I'd say, do you have it? Can you corroborate it? And they would say no. And so I said, then we should not believe Phil Corso. And they said, oh no, he did really strange stuff.
In other words, they're saying, I don't want to admit to any of this. I don't want any part of it. But then you ask about Colonel Corso, and they say, well, yes.
Yeah, they give him very high marks, and these were contemporaries. They were guys who were colonels with him, and as I said, they stayed in and progressed, and at least one of them took General Trudeau's position 2 or 3 moves down, several years later.
All right, let's try developing as we did in the last interview, Colonel, because it is very important. Tell the story about General Trudeau one day delivering to you a file cabinet.
Yes. Well, he gave me the file cabinet, and he said, Phil, there's some things in there. I want you to develop a program for utilization and exploitation of these.
Utilization and exploitation.
With applied engineering, that means go out to industry and people are working on this. You find them, you develop a plan for me.
All right, here you had a file cabinet full of all this stuff. Where did he say it came from?
He didn't tell me. He said, it's in there, Phil. It'll tell you where it came from.
So normally you were working with Soviet stuff or German stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would think that at that moment you probably thought that's exactly what was in the cabinet.
Yeah. Well, I had 3-drawer cabinet, Mossler safe, and the top drawer was General Trudeau used to kid me and says that's Corso's junk drawer.
Yeah.
And the UFOs fly in and out of that drawer. And because when I'd lay these artifacts on the table, they looked like junk. So he laughed about that and said, of course, it was junk pile.
What was in your junk pile, Colonel?
Well, there was a piece of metal, about a piece of postcard, and the atoms were lined in it.
The atoms were aligned in it?
Aligned. That made it give it terrific strength. Radiation wouldn't pass through. And he gave me the instruction. He told me one day, he said, Phil, I'm going to appoint a special team, and you're in charge, and the general that John just talked about knows about that team, because he was there at the time. He was a colonel with me. And that team, he told me this. He said, Phil, this is bigger than Los Alamos. Space vehicles, light as a feather, can travel space, no radiation penetrate it, and nothing can harm them. Because it was paper thin, but the strength was terrific. You couldn't dent it, we couldn't scratch it or anything. Of course, and he told me also, if you find anybody is even coming close to this, fund it. And I had the German scientists work with me on that.
So at that point, you took that and you tried to turn it over to somebody in industry and funded them because you had that power.
Yes, we did. I had the power to fund it.
And basically said, back engineer this or figure out what it is, figure out how to make it?
Well, Livermore Lab up at MIT analyzed it for us.
Well, they did.
Yeah, the atoms were lined up in it. I wrote them a letter. And I also wrote Walter Reed a letter. Walter Reed started some interesting discussion there. And my co-author has the letter. Then I wrote to Livermore, and I asked them the question whether they could supply these. They said, do you remember the contract, how it read? That we would send all copies back to you and keep nothing here. And they were right.
A technical correction, by the way, that's Lincoln Lab.
Oh, that's Lincoln. You're right. John. I'm glad you caught that. That was Lincoln Lab, Livermore's on California. So they did that, and they remind me that we made them send all copies back to us to keep nothing in their file. And we funded after all, so they did that. Then I had now this is an interesting story, Art. I had a piece of string, looked like string.
String.
The atoms were aligned in it. It was so tough you couldn't burn it and you couldn't even cut it.
Was it metallic or was it light string or cord? Like thread?
Like cloth. It looked like it.
All right.
The nearest thing in this world that we found that was nearest that was a spider web. Terrific strength. You can stretch a spider web for miles. The spider spins it and aligns the atoms in it. And you can stretch it 5-10 miles before it bends and won't break. And then it springs back into space. Now, we funded that at Wyoming University. We made flight jackets out of it. Only we couldn't make flight jackets because we couldn't get enough of it. We tried to get them to clone the spider, and I think to this day they haven't succeeded. But there's terrific strength in that, in the spider web. Marvelous thing. Atoms are aligned.
Atoms are aligned. Dr. Alexander, now with two pieces of material from this file cabinet that ultimately, I guess, came from Roswell, atoms are aligned. Can you explain that?
Not very easily, actually. As I understand, what he's talking about is that by instead of having a random selection of the atoms, that they were able to establish the polarity in such a way that the strength was greatly increased.
You're right, John.
But they were actually not able to duplicate the metal. Is that correct?
Well, we failed in that, Art.
Failed.
We were never able to do it.
All right.
Now, we invented a small atomic engine that's in the Saturn probes and the Mars probes.
Yes.
It was our little ion engine that we built at Fort Belvoir. And we could never harden that, so we couldn't put it in anything that man could travel in it, because we couldn't harden it, meant keep the radiation out.
All right, but then some other materials from that filing cabinet, for example, this fiber that you're talking about,
yes,
actually turned out to be what we now know as fiber optics. Is that right?
I had a fiber optics I had a bunch of, it looked like wires. I really didn't know what it was. And
right.
Light was emitted from them. There must have been a power source in it. And then we sent that, I think, to Monmouth that went. And from that was a development of fiber optics. But in those days, we didn't even know what it was, Art.
So you just sent it over and said, figure it out?
Yes, we gave it to our labs. That was our lab.
And once again, they weren't doing this gratis or for an investigation. You were commissioning them. You had budget money.
Exactly.
Research and development money that came along with these items you were giving them.
We had a budget then which was tremendous. It was about $2 billion.
$2 billion.
Now, we also gave out RDT&E contracts, research, development, test, and evaluation contracts. The first item that would be built from a research contract, we funded the building to the first one. Then after that, other people and other agencies funded it. So we would fund these until it was actually developed. And we had our own laboratories, our atomic labs, and the night viewing labs were our labs at Fort Belvoir.
So
They're still in existence.
Colonel, what aspect of this were you overseeing? In other words, once you gave somebody a piece of this technology and a budget, what did you then do?
Well, I was supposed to keep track of it, of how it was coming along. For example, I went down to the night viewing device lab one day, and I had their budget in my pocket. And the general told me, go down and see how they're getting along, and I took one of the German scientists with me and 2 Army engineers. We looked it over, and the commander there told me he had misgivings when he heard I was coming. I told him, is my reputation that bad? And then I told him, but in this case, it's a little different. Look at my German friend. He's smiling. He usually doesn't smile. And not only that, but since you're doing such a good job, here's your budget. And I handed him the envelope I had in my pocket. And I told him, but there's a hitch to that. The war is heating up in Vietnam. We need this viewing device for the troops with 3 to 6 months. They did it. And John knows he had one of the weapons, or one of the rangefinders.